Hello, Bill Kovacevic here again, and welcome to Module 10. We'll be talking about architects and designers, how to work with them, how to really get along with them, and even the difficult architects are essentially always professional. Most designers are, of course, and the trick is quite simple. Be yourself and be prepared to show what you know and be diligent in what you say. To understand architects, you also have to understand that they are thorough and complete project managers. That's their training. Their training is for them to know everything about every aspect of their building. And the only area that their training does not cover too well, in fact, not very well at all, is sign technology. About the extent of and I recommend all sign shops to actually get themselves the book American Standards, American's Architectural Standards. It's a fabulous book. It's very expensive, but it's worth it. And it gives you an idea just how extensive the architect's training is all about. And about the only thing they have in there covering signs is wayfinding, and it's very perfunctory. Architects don't like sales pitches because they're not there to buy anything. They're to learn and how to incorporate what you have into their designs. Credibility is established how well you respond, and you're going to be measured for what you know. They have a sense of if you know or don't know what you're talking about. Your knowledge, your basic construction details, how familiar are you with architectural terms, your ability to read their plans and understand what they're going. Never be afraid of asking questions for fear of sounding ignorant. That's not the issue here. It's to be able to absorb what they're showing you and be very straightforward. Your interpretation is critical here because you're going to, if you're the salesperson, you have to bring this back to your designer. And your designer should be part of the process in order to make this a collaborative effort. If you are the designer, and as I was, and this is one of the reasons I know how to deal with architects, is because at a very early period of my career, the company sent me out to deal with architects rather than the salespeople, in order to sort of scout and get an idea of what the projects were all about. Because most salespeople, at least at that time, perhaps less today, are intimidated. I suspect most salespeople are still intimidated by architects, and that's why it's so critical to get the essence of what they want, and to be able to confirm to them that you are a collaborator, that you understand what their needs are. And you run into situations that are difficult to explain, you must at least be able to provide alternatives. Not all architects understand necessarily the exigencies of putting signs together and building them and putting them correctly, and all the rules and regulations, the UL, and so on, the UV issues and so on, all the technical aspects that affect signs. You must be able to show that to them and understand how to incorporate it into their design. The architect's status within an organization can be very, 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 the word is very delicate, because you don't know whether you're talking to the decision maker, or he's someone out there, a junior, perhaps just taking the information that you have to offer or to contribute, and then reinterpret it to the person in charge, really in charge of the project. So you have to be able to ascertain who is this going to, and how is my message and how are my concepts or ideas and solutions going to be interpreted. The recommendations are usually reinterpreted to a higher authority. But understanding architects is really just appreciating that they are the master project managers. They manage the project, whether they've designed the building themselves or they are the executors of putting the project together. They are essential project managers. And if you are going to pattern yourself as a sign professional, I would strongly suggest you look and study how architects are trained. Designers, they're one of the most important things about working with design firms is to understand what are their fortes. Are they essentially graphics designers, or are they all-encompassing? And there are very few of those companies today. When I talk about the origins of branding or branding designers or signs, we can go back to the very first people, such as Lippincott Margulies, the ones that we're most familiar with, the ones that I was exposed to in the 60s when I started. Lippincott and Margulies were the consummate design firms because they covered every aspect of branding, and that went to the nitty-gritty of actual fabrication of signs, most notably GM, Ford, Chrysler, American Motors, Royal Bank, the very first Royal Bank, Leo, the hairy lion logos. These were all designed by Lippincott and Margulies, and subsequently all other firms patterned themselves after Lippincott and Margulies. Design firms are really they research into the brand, they research every aspect of the visual of their clients' requirements. They are very strong listeners. Do not underestimate their sign knowledge, because that could backfire on you if you assume that, and a lot of sign companies do that. They assume that the designer doesn't know what he's talking about, and that he wants floating signs with no visible supports and yada yada. But there's a method to how they arrive at what they want. Details of their projects will usually, when they expose their project, it will reveal quickly their sign knowledge, and you might be putting missing links into it before tendering. So it's what we call brain picking. So that area is always it's a judgment call that the salesperson and the design team will know whether and how to approach this particular project. At all times, be scientific, and by that, the most subjective area of sign discussions are usually around colors and shapes and so on, and they are quite often they run into difficulties in terms of being able to reproduce. And the most common one, and I'm sure every sign guy will tell you that, it's when a designer brings Pantone colors. How do you get out of, and explaining to a designer that certain colors would be a problem illuminating their transmissivity issues and so on. And the best way to do it is, and I've always used that, is I look at the Pantone chart in any particular color, and I will look at the content of black. And if it's something like 3, 4, 5% black, you use that scientifically to demonstrate that in order to reproduce that particular color, whether you're spray painting or bringing it into or having it custom made by either 3M or Arlon, whoever is going to produce the vinyl, is going to be problematic because of light transmission and the muddiness and so on. So that's an example of how to be very scientific in your discussions. And when you talk about serif letters that are much too narrow, the difficulty of passing a light engine through it, whether it be LEDs or in the past it used to be neon, but those are issues. Be as scientific as possible and understand the physical dimensions of the sign that you're discussing, and be ready to come up with alternatives, because for every criticism that if you put obstacles in their way without providing a solution, you're going to lose them. So be as resourceful, because you have to be a collaborator, and that is the easiest way to understand designers, because they are more varied in character and knowledge than the architects are. When researching for this project, I had to find out who would be how would we describe somebody, or who is the originator of the idea of branding or rebranding, and the idea of that the visual, the environment is going to change, and for what reason, and so on. And so we talk about the known industrial designers such as Margulies, Lippincott and Margulies that I mentioned earlier. But who is it that sort of set the concept going? Well, in the 1920s, the 20s were perhaps the most exciting and perhaps the least known of the decades of the 20th century for the visual arts. But out of the 1920s, when everybody was floating in money and the stock markets were going bananas, and decorative arts and art was opening up, society was becoming a little freer, and so on. One chap comes out of all of that sort of got the thing going up on changing looks and changing branding, and that's Ernest Elmo Calkins. He created the style obsolescence concept. And if you ever wondered how come sign programs change and have a lifespan on the average between 5 and 10 years, some a little longer, some a little less, but on the average it's about 5. And I can attest to that, because in the 53 years that I've been in the business, I have seen several of the clients that I worked with change their programs every 5 or 6 years. Some people, such as the banks, are probably the best example. Well, this is the chap, this Ernest Elmo Calkins. He's an advertising genius. He created the concept of style obsolescence. In other words, change. Change is important because society changes, generations change, and you have to refreshen your image. Thank God for that concept, because there would be difficulties without that idea. This is an example of how he brought forth the idea that your storefront is your advertising message also. The idea that you put on a fresh look, a more contemporary look, and that you have to stay with the times and keep up with the trends. Walter Darwin Teague, he's credited as being the chap that created the idea of corporate identity. And he was the one that created the concept, really, of having an integrated, what I referred to in previous modules. I talked about retail identity, retail visual identity. Well, Walter Darwin Teague is actually the grandfather of that concept. And the first known sign program per se was Texaco. And if you take a look at that picture, this is the late 30s, around 37, 38, 39. That Texaco sign with the overhead lamp was made out of porcelain, and the columns were custom designed, custom shaped and welded units shipped all over the country. It was a standard. And that created the trend for a standard look for oil companies. Oil companies were really the catalysts for this idea that you have to maintain a constant and even image. Walter Darwin Teague created for the New York World's Fair that gigantic cash register. That's what he was most notable for. Consistency is the last refuge of the unimaginative. And I bet Oscar Wilde, when he said this, probably tried to underline that anybody that is just satisfied with the status quo is probably just going to live in a dull, unimaginative world. You need to think, and you need to imagine the next step, the next trend. It's not left to others. You have to be the engine for that as much as possible. Participate, get going. In trying to describe how to work with architects, I had to go back and forge around, and when I left Transworld, I left a treasure trove of so many good projects that I had kept on file, and I always look at and study my projects from the very embryonic stage, the early sketches and so on. And out of the many sketches that on this particular project, I finally got one of the last ones that came closest to to what ultimately happened. But in this case, I worked with a wonderful architect. Her name was Michelle Descaries. A wonderful architect, very imaginative, and a very tenacious person. She did not let go of a concept, and she was very, very adamant when she had an idea she wanted to work with. She wanted to work with and make it come to fruition. She would look at everything imaginable. It was one of those rare people that you could talk to and exchange ideas, no matter how hairy or crazy. And I save this amongst one of the highlights of my long career of working with architects. The idea is, this is a former hotel, used to be the Sheraton Mount Royal, and when they closed the hotel, they converted that into condo, office, and boutiques, and they called it the Cour Mont-Royal. And there was an insurance company that had just merged with several others called Clarica. It has since disappeared because I think that's what they do, insurance companies. They're like the big fish eating the smaller fish, and so on. Well, this was this was going to be their head office, and they wanted something elegant but at the same time not too commercial, and without and trying to integrate with the classic facade, with Roman columns, with the Corinthian capitals and so on, and to make this as light as possible and as elegant as possible. Those were the catchphrases I'm translating right now in my head. The challenge was, how do we get this sign to look like it's floating, it's light, and it's fluffy, and it's not really imposed on those columns. So we came up with the idea of using these columns as the essential support system. So in effect, we sort of created a very expansive pylon sign, if you will. We used two giant columns, and we spread this arc, if you will, if you see it in plan, to spread out. And we wanted the letters to be attached to tempered glass, to have that nice diaphanous look. Well, the white LEDs had just come out. They were not very efficient as yet. They had a lifespan of 20,000 hours, but we gambled. You said, well, look, if we have to change the LEDs after 20,000 hours, we'll do so. So we have one of the first white illuminated channel letters, epoxy applied onto tempered glass. Also, within the package of this, the Cour Mont-Royal had urns, these giant urns, and she wanted to evoke the shape of that urn in the Clarica corporate ID, but also had the civic number. And again, I couldn't use LEDs in this context. I had to work and manage with fluorescence, with edge lighting, and so on. But the real challenge, Michelle wanted a real brass tube. And I said to her, well, look, this is going to, unless we cast it ourselves. I looked around. I checked with a lot of plumbing supplies if the copper can be somehow treated and so on and so forth. And then I remembered something that I had seen in Las Vegas, and I was curious enough. In Las Vegas, there was a process called Luminor. It is spray painting with real metal powder, carried in a resinous type. It's a dry application. It's a real brass or real copper, or it could even be rust. You could just about do any metallic substance and suspend it in the resin and spray it and apply it, and it's virtually indestructible. When you see those brass statues and the brass works in Las Vegas, it's made with Luminor, the Luminor process. So the other challenge was when we how do you shape this thing? Normally, you take pipe and use a ball and mandrels principle. It's you put a ball in a tube, and you shape it and you turn it. And our regular ball and mandrel, the chap that I used to work with on curved pipes and curved support systems, well, he says that's much too tight, much too narrow, can't do it, yada yada yada. To make a long story short, it was impossible. And where would I get a very malleable 4-inch diameter pipe? Well, with some effort, I discovered that you could use the exhaust pipes for that you see coming out of diesel trucks. You know, those things that sort of project upwards and exhaust. And I got one of those pipes, and we discussed with our team, production team, and the ball and mandrel, we can do parts of it. And lo and behold, we were able to make that what you see, a perfectly shaped brass. We went out to the people, and they sprayed the luminor on it, and to this day it's still a brass, for all intents and purposes, a brass tube. That's what you see, that's what you got. Of course, we have since gotten rid of Clarica, but that gives you an idea of how the complexity of making it is extremely thin. She wanted something extremely thin, and the letters to be illuminated by indirect illumination. So we worked at it, we got it. And the most satisfying part of this sign was the brass tube. The idea of how to support this whole thing, I got from a trip on the Adriatic coast. These are shots from the interior of Diocletian's palace. And the Adriatic course is subject to earthquakes, and this particular Diocletian palace has been around since the 4th century, 330, built by Diocletian. Now, those columns are subject to a tremendous stress during earthquakes, so they've had to be reinforced and they've had to be repaired. And I noticed those collars that keep the fissures to a minimum, and I used that concept as that collar in order to build this particular thing for the Clarica portal. That luminor, the luminor, the company that I worked with had since gone out of business, but it's the luminor franchise has been taken over by these people, Market Metal. And for those that are interested, take a look at some of their projects. You can actually see the Wynn Casino in Las Vegas. It's fabulous. You can do extraordinary things with luminor. And the beauty of it is that you're really using the real metal, the real ore, in order to achieve these textures. So looking out, and this is the design intent achieved. I was very proud of that, and that is it's one of the few jobs that come out exactly as planned, exactly as it comes off your sketch pad, and the sweat and the long hours discussions with the architect, and it's a payoff. The customer was extremely pleased. There was some boo-boos afterwards because the channel letters, one of the channels actually caught fire. There was a short circuit burn and had to be changed, but that was the early periods of the white LEDs, and the oxidation of copper caused all sorts of little difficulties. In spite of the fact there's low voltage, they were still subject to flare-ups. Nonetheless, it is still a classic, and it's one of my favorite projects. I'm so happy to be able to share it with you. Updated when Clarica went out, you could see that they've replicated the urn concept on that glass, and now it serves as a very fancy civic number support, 1555 illuminated. When I say make architects happy, you have to talk their language, and you have to get as close as possible to what they really want. And by that means really understanding all the key areas where you can incorporate signs and master them where you become the person to go to. Now, this is an example here. It was a large fascia, large curtain wall with mullionless window frames, and the spandrel system, there was the only area where you could put signs is in that spandrel area. And spandrels areas are on any curtain wall is that area that does not project into any living space. It usually to create the illusion of a continuity, but it covers up the structure, the actual and so on. And in this particular instance, we were able to take over that whole spandrel concept. What we've done here is we created a sign that in effect replicates a thermal pane window. Thermal pane windows they're double, of course, and they have ozone in it, and they're retained within the mullion system. And in this case, again, it's a frameless mullion system. There's no mullion in itself, it's hidden. So the trick was how to incorporate that spandrel panel with the push-through letters and illuminate it. And we were able to do that and confine it within 2 inches, and respect the thermal issues, the insulation, so on, so that we don't get any thermal transfer. Usually the things that you have to worry about in any spandrel situation. But this gives you, I think, the perfect example of how you can win over an architect and work with them. You become a collaborator. Understanding architecture is going to be even more important and essential to the sign professional, whether you're the salesperson or the designer or people in production. Understanding glass, that is the essential. I'm looking forward to Module 11. Thank you.